So this part is a compressed video. It took me about an hour and a half to record it, maybe 2 hours. And I decided to compress it because I'm really not using anything new in terms of techniques. It's getting like somewhere in the middle of the process, it gets pretty boring and repetitive in terms of what you're doing. But it's never boring in terms of design, but in terms of explanation of what's going on, I think it's all pretty standard. So as you can see right here, I was looking at the references, and the actual gun has a number of buttons on each side. I believe this one is for either release of the ammo, or maybe it's a safety trigger. In my particular design, I think it doesn't even matter what it is. I made a duplicate of the buttons, so I have two similar buttons on each side. This, because of the location of the button, it's kind of closer to the trigger. I would say it's probably a safety switch. Just like we were discussing before, a lot of things need to have that layer of logic, right? So, for example, we have a button in the back right under the stock next to the ammo clip, and that would probably be the button that's releasing it. By the way, you're looking at me using the offset. I use offset really often when I need to create a surface that's matching a previous one but smaller or bigger. It usually makes sense when you're trying to scale some sort of design. Next up, I was struggling a lot with this particular part. I think it took me the most because, as you can see in the reference, it has some complex shapes, but in the end, what matters in solving it is how you understand what's going on with the gun. It's very rarely about just copying it, and plus also you can see that it's not symmetrical on each side. So it's not just about copying. You need to look at the design and be able to deconstruct it, figure out what exactly is happening. In that way, you will be able to interpret the parts so that you don't have to repeat them exactly. This design, I think it's supposed to reload or put the bullet in the chamber after you're out. So this lever, as I understand, I haven't watched the videos of how this gun works, but it would actually make a lot of sense. As you can see, I'm using the offset again. It's super easy to repeat the shape. But as I was saying, it would actually make sense to watch the video, see how that works, to get a better understanding. In my case, I just understand that as you pull the lever towards yourself while you're holding the gun, it will pull on this cylinder. The other cylinder, I was kind of like mistaking the shape here. The other cylinder that you see there is more likely the barrel, but I might be wrong. But since I don't have the barrel here yet, I should have just left it and not touched it at all, just designing the lever. I usually don't block out. I just want to explain like a little bit about adding details. I usually don't block out details. So parts that are of medium size and surface detail, I will fully model each detail, because later, as I was explaining earlier in this lesson, when it's a little bit about repetition, if you have a detail or a little part that's fully designed, you're able to actually propagate it throughout the rest of your design in the gun or whatever you're designing. So in that sense, sometimes it's more important to actually finish one part because you will be able to reuse it later. You can see that now I'm moving forward with the barrel. Normally, I would say that the diameter of the barrel would be dictated by the caliber that the gun is using. So even though I imported the bullets later, I could have just imported the bullet at this point and went off the diameter of the casing. But you can see that all of these operations, they're very straightforward. A lot of times it's all about just combining cylinders, very simple shapes, simple geometry, then merging it together. For example, to add that threading, I didn't need to actually create the real thread. What I did here is I created a small ring that was empty inside, and then I'm using pattern on the path to propagate it throughout the full length of the cylinder. It's not an actual thread, but it gives you the illusion of the thread, which is, more important in this case. Also, one of the decisions was that this gun, in a lot of designs, has the foregrip, and I only decided to model the part of the barrel that is accommodating the grip, but I didn't include the grip. I didn't feel like it, basically. I thought that design looks a little more interesting without it because most designs do have it. Again, this whole front end is highly improvised, just because sometimes even if you're modeling something existing, you're referencing a very particular assembly in the real world, and not all guns are the same. Of course, certain parts are all similar because they are standard, but most of the time the barrel and basically the whole front end of the gun is highly adjustable, and there are plenty of modifications. So to me, it makes sense to keep the basic parts the same and then get creative freedom with parts that are also modified or more often modified in the real world. With the length of the barrel, I was actually going through several lengths to test it, and in this particular case, right now it's longer, but the final is a little shorter. I was thinking that a shorter barrel would look a little more aggressive. As you know, the shorter the barrel, basically the slower the velocity of the projectile. So, if I'm not mistaken, so usually for close quarter combat, the barrel would be shorter, because only shorter visually in bullpup designs where the ammo clip goes behind the trigger. It's a very particular type of design, basically made to make the whole weapon smaller. The barrel is hidden in the body of the gun. So if it's sticking way too far in a bullpup design, it usually makes very little sense, because that would mean that the barrel is way too long. But you can always adjust the how it's perceived visually by adding more bolt-ons and all kinds of accessories like flash hider, muzzle brake, stuff like this. Also, I'm moving forward here with the upper rail, and initially I went through a couple of iterations here that I didn't include. One of them was exactly like in the reference, but I wasn't feeling it, so I decided to kind of design my own version. The thinking here is that there's the main part on the very bottom, a very plain flat bar that is attached to the top of the rifle. It has no threading, anything. I will add the bolts in there later. And then there are two parts here that are diagonal. And in my mind, I was thinking that these parts can be interchangeable. So basically, at the very end, you will see in the final, here you don't actually see the little pins on the very bottom. My thinking was that you can take those out and swap for shorter or higher to adjust, like basically to accommodate different heights. And these would make more sense that these parts are highly customizable. So there's no particular intention here to follow a certain type of design, certain style. This is totally, freehand, basically. This is an exercise in designing. So here you can see that I'm adding the part that basically manifests a rail. So we have that T-shaped rail on the bottom, and this rail is attached to the main to the upper receiver of the gun, and then these two diagonal parts are sliding back and forth on this rail, but they will be fixed by pins that I'm going to be adding later. Also, I wanted to say that this whole gun is really not to scale. So a lot of times if you're not worried about the scale initially, you may corner yourself into working with details that are way too small. I would say that it's generally okay if you're not planning to 3D print, plus in the real world, I mean in 3D world, everything is easily scalable. So if you find that like your scale is off or something, or if you're working with parts that you import through, like from a outside library per se, and they are not to scale, I would say that it's easier to scale your whole design up, just because the tiny details will not be possible on the small scale. And the reason I was mentioning that is that, which by the way, you can see that I'm always constantly reusing the types of bolts that I only created once. Not even because it's hard to model a bolt like this or like a screw. It's mostly because I'm trying to use this element as the design that's repeating. The Picatinny rail. With the Picatinny rail, there's plenty of available files online for the Picatinny rail. Most of the time, it just doesn't make sense to model your own. It's actually a lot easier to just grab an existing Picatinny rail and then use it as the world scale reference and then work based on that. I think it's such a standardized design that it's really easy to measure the scale using that Picatinny rail. The Picatinny rail, if for some reason you don't know what it is, it's this horizontal plank right here that's used to mount various accessories on the gun. So here I'm also adding just little cutouts that I noticed much later in the design. I thought the stock is ready to go, but then it's a good exercise to constantly check your references, go back and see with kind of like a fresh look what you might have missed, especially if you're trying to mimic the design one-to-one. So not entirely sure what that part does, but I thought it's a neat little design. So and then you can see me here adding the button to release the ammo clip. I didn't overthink the design because it feels like you will never be able to see it. And that's a very important message I want you to understand when you're modeling with an intention of showing your design from a very particular angle. I think that usually goes for like vehicles, very rarely about guns, because guns, it's you actually want to show them off from like different angles, different perspective. But the idea here is most of the time it makes sense to model to a particular shot that you're creating. So that button on the bottom, it doesn't even make sense to overwork it. But stuff that can be seen from the side, from the back, I would say that it's all worth working on the little details there, especially on stuff like this little loop. I would say that it's one of those parts that are super useful in the KitBash library. So I will actually try to explain how to create a component out of it and just save it separately into your library in the next part. I will just have a little part explaining the KitBash libraries and assemblies, which this design is already in assembly, and we have a scope that's we designed in the previous lesson that's just sitting as a separate file. Additionally, I also have what's it called? A muzzle brake to attach to the gun, and all of that I'm going to be using to basically just accessorize, enhance the look of the gun, which is not really necessary. A lot of times you can build that from scratch, but if you're on schedule, short on time, that's when the KitBash libraries come to save the day. So I think this is pretty much it. Let's move on to the next part and talk about the assemblies.